Laudetur Jesus Christus. Vatican and World News.
In the headlines this Sunday, November the 17th, Pope Francis decries religious persecution worldwide. A new analysis reveals that the number of casualties in Sudan's bloody civil war is far higher than previously thought. And in his homily for the World Day of the Poor, the Pope calls for Christians to act with hope and compassion in the face of injustice. In the Vatican, I'm Joseph Tulloch. At the Sunday Angelus today, Pope Francis discussed the example set by three martyrs who, he said, bravely lived out their faith in the face of religious persecution. He mentioned Luigi Palic, a Franciscan priest, and Gion Gazzulli, a diocesan priest, both from Albania, who were beatified on Saturday for their witness during the religious persecution in the country last century. The Pope's thoughts then went to Father Max Josef Metzger, who gave his life as a witness to peace, including opposing Nazi oppression, and was beatified recently in Freiburg in Germany. The Pope invited all those present to look to these martyrs as a source of inspiration, particularly, he said, for Christians who continue to face discrimination today. Around the world today, millions of believers of many different faiths still face discrimination, violence and death simply for practicing their religion. Francesca Merlo has this report on the state of religious freedom worldwide.
Over 360 million Christians live in regions where they face high levels of persecution. This includes violence, imprisonment, displacement, and systemic discrimination. According to Aid to the Church in Need, 2/3 of the global population live in countries where religious freedom is either severely restricted or completely non-existent. Amongst the countries in which Christians are persecuted for their faith is Nigeria, where Islamist extremists continue to target Christian communities, often kidnapping and killing people who openly profess their faith. Similarly, in India, where the majority of the population is Hindu, Christians and other religious minorities are experiencing a rise in hostilities, with violence being perpetrated and there too churches being destroyed. Pope Francis, throughout the entirety of his pontificate, has called for prayers and solidarity for persecuted Christians worldwide. But religious persecution does not stop at Christianity. It is a global issue that affects all faiths and creeds, and therefore all of humanity. One of these minorities, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, for whom Pope Francis often prays. Labelled as stateless by the Myanmar government, the Rohingyas have been victims of systemic discrimination for decades. The situation worsened in 2017 when the military launched a violent campaign against the Rohingya, resulting in the deaths of thousands and the displacement of over 700,000 people who fled to neighbouring Bangladesh. Though the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar is the most recent and blatant form of religious persecution, other religious minorities continue to suffer under the hands of extremist governments. In Afghanistan, though very few in number, Hindus and Sikhs have been decimated and flee the country due to threats from extremist groups. The Church, under the guidance of Pope Francis, continues to stand firm in its fight for religious freedom across the globe, and Pope Francis so often extends his prayers and closeness to all people who suffer any form of injustice worldwide, no matter the faith, as he says, we are all members of one human family. I'm Francesca Merlo.
And at the Angelus today, Pope Francis prayed, as he so often does, for Sudan, a country caught in a civil war as brutal as the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, one which, however, rarely makes the headlines in the rest of the world. Recently, a new study revealed that the number of people dying because of the civil war in the country is notably higher than previously thought. Nathan Morley reports.
Until recently, the United Nations and other aid organisations had been using the figure of 20,000 confirmed deaths. However, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Sudan Research Group now says that more than 61,000 people have died in Khartoum state, where fighting erupted last year. It said of these, 26,000 people were killed as a direct result of the violence, but also observed that the leading cause of death across Sudan was preventable diseases and starvation. Elsewhere, there have been numerous reports of violence and ethnic cleansing in the Darfur region. Compounding matters, it's previously been estimated that the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance in Sudan has reached 25 million, a figure that amounts to more than half of the population. Sudan has been witnessing brutal armed clashes between the Sudanese army and the RSF since April last year, with both sides accusing each other of initiating the conflict. The United Nations has previously said the worsening situation is having a negative impact on neighbouring countries, many of which are coping with their own crises. Since the conflict erupted, day-to-day living has become increasingly difficult amid frequent power cuts. Compounding matters, prices for staple goods have shot up, and there is a dearth of imported goods such as flour and cooking oil. On Sunday, the United Kingdom announced a $143 million aid boost to support those affected by war in the country. The UK Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, said the brutal conflict in Sudan had caused unimaginable suffering. He said the people of Sudan need more aid, which is why the United Kingdom is helping to provide much-needed food, shelter and education for the most vulnerable. For Vatican Radio, this is Nathan Morley reporting.
And at the Angelus today, Pope Francis again prayed for tormented Ukraine. Our correspondent Stefan Boss is in Budapest and he reports on a large-scale Russian missile and drone attack on the country that has killed at least 7 people and has threatened the country's energy infrastructure.
Blasts reverberate across Ukraine's capital Kiev and other cities as Russia stages its most giant missile and drone strikes since August. More than 200 strikes hit areas, including the capital, with Ukraine's energy infrastructure as the main focus of Russia's attack. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia's army fired 120 missiles, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and 90 drones, killing and injuring numerous people. He expressed his deepest condolences as it became clear that people were killed in cities Lviv, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa and Mykolaiv. Dozens have been injured. Ukraine's largest private energy provider said the attack had seriously damaged equipment at thermal power stations. Emergency power cuts were implemented in the Kiev, Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. In response to the attacks, at least 2 people were reportedly killed in Ukrainian drone strikes on the Belgorod and Kursk regions inside Russia. With fighting ongoing, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Russian President Vladimir Putin has not shifted in his thinking about the war in Ukraine. He spoke as a march against the war was underway, organized by the Russian opposition in exile in Berlin. It underscored mounting concern that a nearly 3-year-old war could turn into a larger international armed conflict. For Vatican Radio, I am Stefan Boss, reporting.
And in one more bit of world news, and a new book set to be released on Tuesday in Italy, Spain and Latin America, and later on in other countries, Pope Francis has said that, according to some experts, what is happening in Gaza has the characteristics of a genocide. This, the Pope said, should be, quote, carefully investigated to determine whether it fits into the technical definition formulated by jurists and by international bodies. Today is the World Day of the Poor, celebrated on the 33rd Sunday of Ordinary Time every year since 2017. The World Day was established by Pope Francis in his apostolic letter Misericordia et Misera, issued in 2016 for the end of the extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy. To mark the occasion, Pope Francis today celebrated Mass in St. Peter's Basilica with many of Rome's homeless community in attendance. Lisa Zingarini reports on the Pope's sermon for the occasion.
Reflecting on the apocalyptic imagery from the reading of the day taken from Mark's Gospel, the Pope opened his homily by acknowledging the deep feelings of anguish that resonate today. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, reads the text, which he said reflects the pains of our time, famine, war, inequality, and the indifference that follows. In a world in which social media amplify fears and insecurities, we might be tempted to succumb to despondency in the face of this scenario. However, the Pope warned that resigning in this way can lead us to being robbed of the ability to see God's hand at work and to reduce faith to a harmless devotion that lacks transformative power. Instead, he emphasized that just when everything seems to collapse, God comes. God gathers us to save us. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, the Pope explained, the darkest moments become the dawn of salvation. Drawing on the image of a budding fig tree, he urged the faithful to look for signs of hope, even in the harshest realities. For example, the Lord's presence among the poor and suffering reminds us that where there seems to be only injustice, pain and poverty, the Lord draws near to free us. The mission of Christ's disciples, then, is to make this hope visible through acts of justice, solidarity and charity, with gestures of kindness and broader commitments to social and environmental justice. Pope Francis concluded by calling on the faithful not to forget the poor, reminding us that change begins with small daily actions, whether in how we live, how we care for our environment, or how we share our resources. Each act of compassion can become a sign of hope, like the first leaves sprouting on the fig tree. I am Lisa Zengarini.
And after the Mass, Pope Francis welcomed about 1,300 of Rome's poor into the Vatican for a special lunch. During the lunch, the Pope expressed his gratitude to all those in dioceses and parishes around the world who have undertaken initiatives in favour of the disadvantaged. The lunch was offered by the Italian Red Cross, and around 340 volunteers served the meal. And finally, at his weekly Angelus address, earlier today, Pope Francis offered his reflection on the day's Gospel reading and explained how, in Christ, quote, we shall all one day find again the things and people who have passed away. Thad Jones tells us more.
Pope Francis began his Sunday Angelus address by quoting Jesus' words from today's Gospel. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. These words might suggest the idea of the end of the world, the Pope said, but the Lord seizes the opportunity to offer a different interpretation, namely that heaven and earth will pass away, but the Lord's words will not pass away. This, the Pope said, would be the subject for his catechesis: what passes away and what remains.
Anzitutto ciò che passa.
Turning initially to consider things that pass away, the Pope noted that in some circumstances in our life, when we're going through a crisis or experience some failure, we have the feeling that everything is coming to an end, and even the most beautiful things pass away. These crises, the Pope stressed, though difficult, are important because they teach us to accord everything its due weight and not attach our hearts to the realities of this world. And while everything in this world passes away, the Pope said, Jesus' words do not. They remain for eternity. And because Christ himself remains, so does everything else.
In lui, in Cristo.
In him, the Pope stressed, we shall one day find again the things and people who've passed away and who've accompanied us in our earthly existence. In the light of this promise of resurrection, every reality takes on new meaning. Everything dies, and we too one day will die. But we will lose nothing of what we've built and loved, because death will be the beginning of a new life.
E allora chiediamoci, siamo attaccati alle cose
Pope Francis then brought his catechesis to a conclusion with an invitation to his listeners to reflect on what they value in their own lives. He said, let us ask ourselves, are we attached to earthly things which pass quickly, or to the words of the Lord, which remain and guide us towards eternity? I'm Thad Jones.
That brings us to the end of this edition of Vatican and World News. For more on the World Day of the Poor or the Pope's Angelus address today, please do visit our website at www.vaticannews.va, and you can also catch the latest updates on our Facebook, X and Instagram pages. Many thanks go to Patrizio Ciprari in the studio. In the Vatican, I'm Joseph Tulloch. Goodbye.